On the 9th of October 2011, a marine biologist named Elena Vukas leaned over the side of a skiff and lowered 500 oysters onto the floor of a lagoon that had been toxic and lifeless for 60 years. And everyone watching assumed they'd suffocate in the muck within a season. If you love comeback stories like this one, and there are more of them than you'd believe, subscribe and stay with them. The place is Prashna Lagoon on the Adriatic coast. A shallow, still body of water tucked against a weathered fishing town. And on that October morning, the water below her skiff was the colour of weak tea, and it smelled of rot. For 6 decades, this had been the town's dead zone. No fish, no birds, no swimmers. A body of water people had simply, quietly stopped looking at. You grow up beside a thing like that and you learn not to see it. So picture the arithmetic of what she was attempting. One mesh crate lowered into a lagoon that had been suffocating for as long as anyone in that town had been alive. The odds were laughable. Everyone expected them to smother in the sediment before the season turned. That's not what happened. What happened next, the thing the survey team to this day still can't fully account for, is that the lagoon began to clear. Not from the surface down, the way a chemical treatment would work it, from the bottom up. And it did it faster than any dredging or chemistry the region had ever thrown at that water. But that comes later. First, the water. Picture that skiff for a second. 1 crate, 500 oysters, an entire dead lagoon underneath it. Hold that image. You'll need it. I'm Peter, and this is the full story of how 500 oysters cleaned a poisoned lagoon that people had written off for a lifetime. Over the next half hour, we'll walk 3 things: how this lagoon died, then the one strange mechanism almost nobody talks about, the reason 500 small animals could do what heavy machinery couldn't, and finally, what came home once the water went clear. Because things did come home. That's the part that still gives me a chill. But before any of that, we need to sort out what an oyster actually is, because I think most of us have it wrong. The animal you're picturing is a shellfish on a plate, a garnish, a lemon, and a little fork. Forget that, forget it completely. What went into that water was an engineer, and I mean that almost literally. An oyster is a builder. It filters, pulling algae and sediment and suspended muck out of the water and binding it down into the floor. It cements. One oyster settles on the shell of the last, and the last on the one before it, until you have a reef, a hard living structure rising off a soft dead bottom. It rewrites an oyster is not an inhabitant of a lagoon. Given the chance, it becomes the architect of one. And that changes the whole shape of this story. Because before we can understand how 500 oysters brought it back, we have to understand how it died. And it died the way a lot of beautiful things die, slowly, quietly, behind a surface that still looked like water. Through the 1950s, 2 factories on the shore began feeding the lagoon something it could not digest. Through the 1950s, 2 factories on the shore began feeding the lagoon something it could not digest. A tannery on the north bank, a fertilizer works a little way down from it, and between them, day after day, a slow diet of nitrogen and heavy metals leaching into the shallows. Nobody meant to kill a lagoon. That is exactly how a lagoon dies. The nitrogen fed the algae. The algae bloomed, a green scum spreading across the still water, and when a bloom dies, it rots, and rot burns oxygen. So the water gave up its oxygen to the decay, and the fish that needed that oxygen either left or sank. By 1963, the surveys recorded almost no dissolved oxygen at all. A dead lagoon sealed shut. And here is the cruel part. From the shore, it still looked like water. flat, quiet, ordinary. A beautiful lie told by a still surface, because underneath it, nothing was living at all. So how do you unpick 60 years of that? Here's the part that genuinely unsettled the survey team, and the part almost nobody talks about. The animal you're picturing on a plate, dressed with lemon, forget that entirely. Think of it instead as a pump. A single adult oyster filters up to 50 litres of water a day. It draws the water in across its gills, strips out the algae, the suspended sediment, the loose nitrogen, the very things poisoning the lagoon. It doesn't clean the water for you. It eats the thing that dirtied it. Do the arithmetic with me. 500 oysters, 50 litres each every single day. Now picture that running for a year and a half without stopping. That is not a shellfish. That is an engineer working a shift no dredger could match. But the filtering is only the first turn of the wheel. Because clearer water lets sunlight reach the bottom, and sunlight, for the first time in decades, wakes the eelgrass sleeping in the mud. The eelgrass roots and rooting anchors the sediment so it stops clouding the water. And here is the quiet miracle of it. Eelgrass, like any green thing in the light, breathes out oxygen. Oxygen the lagoon had none of. More oxygen means more oysters survive to filter more water, which lets more light through, which wakes more grass, which makes more oxygen. A loop that builds on itself. Scientists call it the clarity cascade. And the simplest way, now I'll be honest with you, the exact order of that loop, what wakes first, what feeds what, is somewhat contested even now. But the principle underneath it is not in doubt. A keystone filter, put back where it belongs, can reverse the very poisoning that erased it. The animal that died first becomes the animal that leads everything else home, which is what makes the plan so hard to believe when you first hear it. They did not treat the water, they did not dredge the floor, they did not dose the lagoon with a single chemical. The lever was almost insultingly simple. Put the filter back and get out of the way. So they did. October the 9th, 2011. One skiff, one crate, 500 oysters lowered onto a floor no one had touched in 60 years. And then everyone waited. No dredgers, no chemicals, just 500 oysters. When the survey team went back down in 2013 with their clarity discs, what the number told them was not a slow improvement. It was a line no one had dared to write down, 30 centimetres to over 2 metres. In a single season and a half, the water had opened up. You could lower a clarity disc off the side of the skiff and watch it fall, and keep watching it, down past a metre and a half, until it settled on a floor no human eye had seen in 60 years. Read that number again, 30 centimetres to over 2 metres. And remember, nobody touched the water to do it. And it wasn't just the water. When Elena Vukas and her survey team went back with proper equipment, they found something that stopped the conversation in the lab. The oysters had a 2016 paper in PLOS One, led by Vukas, logged the reef spreading unaided across 900 square metres, nearly twice the size of the crate's original patch, growing outward on its own, one generation cementing onto the last. And once the reef was there, the lagoon started filling itself back in. 11 fish species returning on their own. Not restocked, not released, they simply arrived, swimming in from the open Adriatic once the water was clear enough and the oxygen high enough to hold them. And standing in the shallows one grey morning, patient and still, the first grey herons anyone in that town had seen in a generation. The World Bank later cited the site as a restoration model, a poisoned lagoon turned into a case study, held up as proof of what the cheapest possible intervention could do. Here is the thing I keep coming back to. Nobody planted the eelgrass. Nobody flew the herons in. Nobody carried buck. The lagoon repaired itself, all of it, the moment the filter was working again. We tend to think of a wounded ecosystem as a patient on a table, something we have to operate on, dose and manage and monitor. They aren't the patients here, they're the medicine. But I want to be honest about what this does not solve. The tannery and the fertilizer works left more than nutrients behind. The heavy metals, the lead, the cadmium, the slow poisons that fed in through the 50s, those are still there, locked into the sediment beneath the reef. The oysters didn't remove them. A hard enough storm, a bad enough surge stirring the bottom, and some of that old poison could lift back into the water. The tannery's legacy hasn't vanished. It's buried, not gone. That's the honest edge of this story, and I won't pretend it away. But the living lagoon came back, the one that people had stopped looking at, the dead zone, the flat brown surface nobody swam. The old people down by the harbour have a word for the place now. Not the lagoon's name, the reef's. They call it Kamenko, little stone. It started as a joke, maybe, or a fisherman's shorthand, but it stuck, the way true names do. And if you walk that harbour today, you'll find it painted on the hulls of small boats, Kamenko, in fresh letters, on vessels working water their grandfathers wrote off as ruined. The word outlasted the ruin. That, to me, is the heart of it. We didn't clean the water, we didn't dredge it or dose it or engineer it. We just stopped standing in the way of the thing that does, and it did more in 18. Tell me in the comments which comeback you want next. There are more of these stories than you'd ever believe, so subscribe and stay with them. And somewhere off that Adriatic coast, on a flat-bottomed skiff at dusk, a woman is still leaning over the side, lowering a crate onto the floor of a place people had given up on. 500 small stones, that's all it takes. Thanks for watching.